I'd like to talk about the two different ways that you can run a wood gasification boiler. And probably the easiest way is to discuss how I use this boiler through the seasons throughout the year. At this moment in time, in the late spring, going into the summer, up to the early autumn, I will batch burn. And typically, I will fill the loading chamber. And if I put the boiler into gasification mode, which is at its full output, and this one is a 40 kilowatt boiler, it will last for approximately 4 hours, and I'll have 160 kilowatts of energy going into the accumulator tank, which will be enough to raise the temperature by 50 degrees. And when the top temperature gauge on my accumulator tank goes from approximately 90 back down to around 50, I'll then batch burn again. And I'll run that sequence from the late spring all the way through to the early autumn until I have a requirement for space heating or central heating in my house. So when I come to the autumn, that's when I would change the way that I would use this boiler. Typically in the summer, where I was managing to get potentially anywhere between 5 to 7 days domestic hot water from one full burn, when I get into the late autumn, I will still batch burn, but I will find that one full batch burn may last me every other day. I have my central heating on for short periods of time, and obviously I still have my domestic hot water requirements. As we then go into the winter, the central heating requirements are increasing, and ultimately the energy that I'm taking off the accumulator tank is increasing. In this situation, I will then need to move to do one batch burn a day, or I may just decide to keep the boiler running 24/7. When you keep the boiler running, I will load the boiler in the morning, and I'll usually load the boiler late in the evening. But when you're running the boiler 24/7, with the control panel, the boiler will be in slumber mode for greater periods of time. Ultimately, it is up to the homeowner to decide from the late autumn through to the early spring which is their preference, whether they prefer to batch burn or whether they prefer to keep the boiler running 24/7. The upside to batch burning is very low heat loss from the boiler itself. If you're batch burning for 4 hours, you're only going to get 4 hours of heat loss from the boiler casing itself. This is where the heat loss is at its greatest. Certainly not the accumulator tank or the pipework itself. If you're running the boiler 24/7, then ultimately the heat losses will be there every hour of the day. And because the boiler is for a greater percentage of the time in slumber mode than gasification mode, the output that you get in kilowatts over a 24-hour period will be similar to batch burning over a 4-hour period. The difference is you've got the heat losses for 24 hours rather than the heat losses for 4 hours. So the downside to running the boiler 24/7 in the late autumn through to the early spring is that you've got increased heat losses. But from a time and motion study, you only need to reload twice a day. The downside to batch burning is the fact that you've got to start a fire and build an ember layer up. Now, typically, this will take between 10 and 15 minutes every day. So it will depend on you as the homeowner, what you prefer, your lifestyle, whether you're self-employed, whether you work from home, but there's nothing to stop you modulating from one form of using the boiler to the other. And then ultimately, when I get to the late spring, I will definitely go back to batch burning as my dependency reduces as far as my requirements for central heating.